All right, hello everyone. So this is the Brainstem Surface Anatomy lab review. So this is going over Lab 5, and again, this is coming to you via the Scrubs team, which is the Student Collaborative Resources for Understanding and Birdie Success. So going through our mission statement one more time, the Scrubs group is a student-driven initiative to develop resources that are made by students for students. And this is resources that as students we feel we would have benefited from while we were within the course. So this is from students who have walked in the same shoes as yourself. And the hope is that this organization will become a staple of this burdened student body and exemplify our collaborative community. And if this is a mission that aligns with your goals or you have a desire to help others that come behind you, we would love for you to join this team. Now, brief disclaimer with that, these resources are made by students and not by faculty, so there is a possibility for errors, although we do try to mitigate this as much as possible. If there's a contradiction at any point within the coursework, please go by what is presented in your course and not by what is present in this material. That said, we do try to limit as many mistakes as possible. Additionally, Scrubs is aiming to give supplemental resources, and they are not a replacement for your instruction by the Brody faculty or other educational material. So once again, please use these resources as a supplement, but not as your primary resource for course material. And with that, let's go ahead and get into the Brainstem surface anatomy. This should be a relatively short video, as this is really just an overview of the surface anatomy. The next video will go in much more in depth as we start to look at the cross-sectional planes of the brainstem. So starting with a big overview of what is the brainstem, remember that the brainstem is derived from the mesencephalon and rhomboencephalon in development, the mesencephalon forming the midbrain and the rhomboencephalon forming the medulla and the pons. So going through the components of the brainstem, this is going to be the medulla, the pons, and the mesencephalon or the midbrain. So here is your more inferiorly located more inferiorly located mesencephalon. We go more superiorly, we see our pons, and we go most superiorly, and we're going to see just a little bit of the midbrain from this particular view. And we'll go into these particular components in more detail throughout the remainder of this video. So I do want to point out that this is a good reference image of all the surface anatomy that will be discussed in this video. So I'm going to take a moment and just pause here. I'm not going to spend time going over this particular image, but this is a good thing to come back to during the video, after the video, during review, whatever the case may be. But I find that this is a very good reference image for you to see in a graphical format. So with that, let's go ahead and get into the brain specimen. So starting with the medulla, we are going to start with looking at the anterior portion of the medulla. So I'm going to start looking at the pyramidal decussation, which is something that you should be quite familiar with. The pyramidal decussation is going to be what is going to demarcate the spinal cord more inferiorly and the medulla more superiorly. So right here is the pyramidal decussation, and this is going to mark the beginning of the medulla as we move superiorly. Now, as we're looking at the medulla, there is this fissure right down the middle. This is going to be your anterior median fissure. So your anterior median fissure splits the medullary pyramids, which are on either side. So medullary pyramids on either side of the anterior median fissure. Now, as we look more superiorly in the medulla, you see this little bump here, more laterally to the medullary pyramids. This little bump is called the olive. You are going to have an olive on either side of the medulla. Now, this olive is going to have a little indentation between it and the medullary pyramids. This is going to be your pre-olivary sulcus. So your pre-olivary sulcus is going to be situated between the medullary pyramids and the olive. Now, important to note, in the pre-olivary sulcus, that is the location of cranial nerve 12. So cranial nerve 12, the hypoglossal nerve, is going to be situated in between the medullary pyramids and the olive, as it is exiting the brainstem via the pre-olivary sulcus. Now, if we went more laterally, we would have a post-olivary sulcus, which is a sulcus on the opposite side of the olive. And out of the post-olivary sulcus, you are going to have cranial nerve 9 and cranial nerve 10. So that's your glossopharyngeal and your vagus nerves. So cranial nerves 9 and 10 are coming from the post-olivary sulcus, right, which is behind the olive. If we go even more laterally, so over here on this side is a better view of this, we are going to have our cerebellopontine angle. This is the angle between the cerebellum, which we can see posteriorly, and the pons, which is more superiorly. So it's roughly in this region here. So from the cerebellopontine angle, you're going to have cranial nerve 7, the facial nerve, and cranial nerve 8, the vestibulocochlear nerve. And those nerves are represented right here in this image. Now, I will recommend going back and looking at the the image that was graphically made to really find the cranial nerves 7 and 8, but just know that they are going to be arising from the cerebellopontine angle, which is between the cerebellum more posteriorly and the pons, located more superiorly. Now, as we look at the posterior aspect of the medulla, this is probably where we're going to need to spend the most of the time with this video. Let's look more inferiorly and work our way superiorly. Now, I do want to make the point that the medulla is split into two different components. There is what we call the closed medulla and what we call the open medulla. So, the closed medulla is everything from the pyramidal decussation inferiorly up to the orbix. So the orbix is this region at the bottom of your fourth ventricle, and the orbix is the opening into the central canal. So everything between the pyramidal decussation and the orbix is going to be part of the closed medulla. That is because you are below the fourth ventricle. Now, as you go from the orbix into the fourth ventricle, everything superior to that is part of the medulla will be referred to as the open medulla. And we'll define the borders of the open medulla in a little bit more detail in just a second. But remember, everything below the orbix to the pyramidal decussation is part of the closed medulla. Everything superior that is still part of the medulla is going to be the open medulla. Now, going into some of the specific structures of the closed medulla, we're going to talk about the posterior median sulcus. The posterior median sulcus is a continuation of the sulcus that you saw in the spinal cord. So it's just this continuation as you go superiorly. And on either side of the posterior median sulcus, just like in the spinal cord, you are going to have the grassal fasciculus. So the grassal fasciculus running up just lateral to the posterior median sulcus. Now, at the top of the grassal fasciculus, you're going to have these little bumps. This is going to be the grassal tubercle. So the little bumps or tubercles they're going to be the most superior portion of the fasciculus. Deep to the tubercles, and which we'll see on cross-section in a later lab, that is going to be where the nuclei are located. And the nuclei in the central nervous system are synapse points between neurons. Now, more laterally to the grassal fasciculus, you're going to have the cuneate fasciculus, just like you did in the spinal cord. And as you run superiorly, you're going to have another notch. This is going to be, once again, a tubercle. So this is going to be your cuneate tubercle. And deep to the cuneate tubercle, that is where you're going to find the cuneate nucleus. So fasciculus running superiorly, hit towards the tubercle, and deep to the tubercles, you are going to have the nuclei of these particular tracts. Okay, now moving into the open medulla from this posterior view, we talked about the more inferior border being the orbix. What I want to point out is on either side of the orbix, we have a region that we call the area postrema. The area postrema is the emetic center for the body. So this is going to be where your vomiting response is housed. So that's the area postrema on either side of the orbix. Now, as we move more superiorly, this is our rhomboid fossa, which we'll go into in just a minute, those borders. But I want to point out that the superior border of the medulla are these lines that you see running across these from the lateral recesses of the rhomboid fossa. These lines that we see here are going to be called the stria medullaris. And this is a nerve pathway. This is a nerve pathway that you'll revisit later at a different portion of the course, but I just want to point out here that the stria medullaris is a good marker to look for to demarcate the open medulla inferiorly and the pons superiorly. Now, going into some of the borders of the rhomboid fossa, I want to point out that there is a recess at each one of the corners of the rhomboid fossa. You have a superior recess, an inferior recess, and two lateral recesses. Now, I want to point out up near the superior recess, you have this little bit of tissue superiorly. This is going to be the superior medullary velum. So the superior medullary velum is located superiorly along with a superior recess of the rhomboid fossa. Now, looking at the rhomboid fossa, we see that there is a sulcus that runs right down the middle. This is going to be your median sulcus. On either side of the median sulcus, you have these large bumps. This is your medial eminence. Now, the medial eminence is going to be split into separate components based on where you're at within the rhomboid fossa. So we start superiorly. Everything above the stria medullaris, which we said was this fiber pathway running across, that is going to be the facial colliculus. The facial colliculus, if you go deep to that, that is going to be where you're going to have the nuclei for the facial nerve, as well as your abducens nerve, which is cranial nerve 6. So that is the facial colliculus. If we go more inferiorly, we are going to have the hypoglossal nucleus, hypoglossal trigone. Deep to that would be the hypoglossal nucleus. And then most inferiorly, you're going to have the vagal trigone. the vagal trigone is underneath the hypoglossal trigone and is pushed a little bit laterally once the hypoglossal trigone is present. Now, this is not a great image to see this in, so I would refer you back to that cartoon image where you'll see that in a little bit more detail. Then finally, the sulcus limitans is going to be over here more laterally. This is something that is a lot better to see in a cross-section image, but I want to point out that this is going to demarcate the sensory and motor components of the brainstem. So in the more medial located regions, this is where you're going to have motor components. As you go more laterally, you're going to have the sulcus limitans. It's going to be lateral to the medial eminences. So lateral to the medial eminence here. That's where you're going to have the sulcus limitans, and that's going to, everything lateral to that will be part of a sensory nucleus. So one of those is the vestibular area, which is located most laterally over here near the lateral recesses. So the vestibular area, and it's going to be a component of the vestibular nerve, which is a mostly sensory nerve, or only a sensory nerve. So you have that sensory sensation from the vestibular region going to the vestibular area, which is lateral to the sulcus limitans, which is this groove right lateral to the medial eminences. And that separates motor nuclei more centrally and sensory nuclei more laterally. Now going into the pons, so we've covered the medulla, so we're going more superiorly now, and we're now above the region of the stria medullaris, which separated our open medulla from our pons. From the posterior view, we've already talked about the structures that are located in the rhomboid fossa, so I really just want to hit the cerebellar peduncle components. So you have your superior, inferior, and middle cerebellar peduncles located laterally, and they form one of the borders of the rhomboid fossa in that fourth ventricle. So here goes your cerebellar peduncles. This is the three of them connected together. But what I want to point out is the inferior and superior are located more medially. So you have an inferior cerebellar peduncle down here, superior cerebellar peduncle located in this region, and then most laterally you have your middle cerebellar peduncle. That middle cerebellar peduncle is going to be really important because it is going to be where most of the fibers are coming from the pons. So pontine fibers are coming through the middle cerebellar peduncle, which is going to be located more laterally. And this is going to be the component of the cerebellar peduncles we can see from an anterior view coming from the pons. So I mentioned from an anterior view of the pons, you can see cerebellar peduncle fibers. That is what we see here. These fibers are going to be components of the middle cerebellar peduncle. Now, other things that you need to know about the anterior region of the pons is going to be the cranial nerves that are exiting from this region. The first is going to be abducens nerve, cranial nerve 6. So the abducens nerve is coming out from the anterior portion of the pons, and it's located right in this region here. So that's cranial nerve 6, the abducens nerve. The second nerve that we need to know that comes out from the region of the pons is going to be cranial nerve 5, which is your trigeminal nerve. The trigeminal nerve is a pretty big nerve, right? And it's going to be coming out from the lateral portions of the pons as you move more superiorly. So there goes cranial nerve 5, the trigeminal nerve. Okay, and then move forward, we're now going to be talking about the mesencephalon. So we've now covered the pons, and we're moving superiorly. So we're going to start with the anterior portion of the mesencephalon. Again, this is not the best view to see this in, and we're a little bit tilted, so we can't see great. What I want to point out is on either side of the mesencephalon, or the midbrain, you are going to have the cerebellar peduncles. So this is different than the, you're going to have the cerebral peduncles, which is different than the cerebellar peduncles. The cerebral peduncles connect the brainstem to the cerebrum, and then the cerebellar peduncles connect the brainstem to the cerebellum more posteriorly. So you have a cerebral peduncle on either side, and in between the two, you have your interpeduncular cistern. This should be a review from a previous lab. Now, coming out of the interpeduncular cistern, we are going to have cranial nerve 3, which is your oculomotor nerve. So it's important to know that the cranial nerve 3 comes out between the two cerebral peduncles and the interpeduncular cistern. And then lastly, not seen in this view, but if we looked at the posterior border of the interpeduncular cistern, you are going to have the posterior perforating substance. Now, thinking about the midbrain from a posterior view, a couple of structures that we're going to need to know. The first is the tectum. The tectum is this most posterior region here. The tectum is made up of the superior colliculus and the inferior colliculus. Okay, so the superior colliculus is going to be a relay station for visual information, and the inferior colliculus is a relay station for auditory information. Now, given that this is a relay station, there needs to be another pathway to leave the colliculi to go to more superior regions of the brain. So that is done via the brachium of the inferior colliculus and the brachium of the superior colliculus. If you think back to the Latin of brachium, that's going to be your arm. So this is the arm of the inferior and superior colliculi. So if we look at the inferior colliculus and we look laterally, you're going to see an indentation here that is going to be the location of the brachium of the inferior colliculus. So the inferior colliculus is going to go to, the information is going to go from the inferior colliculus through the brachium of the inferior colliculus into the medial geniculate nucleus. So medial geniculate nucleus located here. So inferior colliculus, brachium of the inferior colliculus to medial geniculate nucleus. If we look at our superior colliculus, that is also going to have a brachium associated. It's just hard to see with the thalamus blocking our view here. So if we look at the superior colliculus, you will have a brachium of the superior colliculus, and that will eventually go deep to what we can see here to the lateral geniculate nucleus. So it's going to go all the way lateral to the medial geniculate nucleus. Those are really the main structures that you need to know from the posterior portion of the midbrain. The one other thing that I want to point out is the trochlear nerve, which is cranial nerve 4, is going to exit from this region just below the inferior colliculus. So if you look, here is our inferior colliculus, we look below that, and right here we have cranial nerve 4, the trochlear nerve exiting the brainstem.